The woman who would one day stand at the vanguard of naval integration was forged in a childhood rooted in practical necessity. Joy Bright was born in 1898. Her father, a practical man of carpentry and real estate, named her Joy to offset his disappointment that his third child was not a boy. She grew up on the developing sandbar of Wildwood, New Jersey, a place of pulverized white sugar beach sand. There, she learned essential skills for survival and self-reliance. She could repair tires on the family Hupmobile and work the bellows for the local blacksmith, Mr. Gabe. Though she excelled in history and English, her struggles with mathematics humbled her intellectual pride. She described math as her bête noire. Her confidence was affirmed at the age of 9 during a terrifying bank run on her father's Marine National Bank. She was entrusted with a satchel of securities and sent alone on a high-stakes errand to a Philadelphia bank to secure cash. This demonstrated profound paternal faith in her capability. Her early life provided a constant lesson in resilience. During her graduation ceremony, while delivering a dramatic address on the theme of death, the fire whistle blew. The audience, largely composed of men, immediately bolted for the doors, causing a mass exodus. Standing before a rapidly thinning crowd, Joy maintained her composure and finished her speech to a sparse audience. She learned early how to adapt and persist through chaos. The looming specter of World War I created a manpower crisis so acute that the U.S. Navy could no longer function without civilian assistance. This critical need finally prompted Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels to pose a revolutionary question. Was there any law, he asked, that says a yeoman must be a man? There was not. The decision to enroll women in the Naval Reserve as Yeoman F was groundbreaking. In February 1918, Joy Bright enlisted as a Yeoman First Class F. This action caused consternation among the medical staff during her physical exam at the Naval Home. Her uniform was modelled after a male chief petty officer's, consisting of a Norfolk jacket, a gauze skirt, and a black neckerchief. While many yeomen, sir, were relegated to clerical desks, Bright quickly found herself in demanding operational roles. These roles stretched the definition of women's service. During a severe coastal northeast storm at Cape May in late 1918, the women were forced to walk through a blizzard to the Naval Air Station after the transport truck failed. Later, returning on a minesweeper, the vessel suffered engine trouble and nearly capsized in heavy seas. Amidst the chaos of the listing deck, Joy and the other yeomen struggled to make coffee and egg sandwiches for the men on deck. This was a raw demonstration of capability beyond the typewriter. Their wartime service was punctuated by moments of historic grandeur, undercut by harsh reality. They witnessed the arrival of the NC-4 flying boat, fresh from the first transatlantic flight. Its grand achievement was slightly marred by the visible makeshift repair of a wing float with a 2x4. Commander Red's first question upon landing was simply, "Where's the head?" By Armistice Day, 11,275 yeomen F were in service. They had proved beyond doubt that women were indispensable, but the patriotic cooperation was short-lived. Following the war's conclusion, Joy's duty shifted to the daily and dreary task of deactivating facilities. This mirrored the swift, unceremonious dismantling of women's service itself. Her life took a dramatic turn when she was swept into the glamorous, yet perilous, world of naval aviation. She met Lieutenant Charles Gray Little, a tall, blonde officer recovering from a broken leg, sustained in an airship accident. They married in the fall of 1920 in a 12th-century Yorkshire church. Their marriage was overshadowed by the inherent dangers of early rigid airships. These massive vessels, like the British R-34, relied on highly flammable hydrogen and suffered from structural weaknesses. Little and his commanding officer, Commander Lewis Maxfield, were training on the British-built ZR-2, a ship notorious for its design flaws. On August 24, 1921, the tension that accompanied every airship flight snapped into tragedy. The ZR-2 suffered a catastrophic structural failure during a trial flight over the Humber River. This was followed immediately by a mighty explosion that plunged the wreck into the river. 51 of the 52 persons aboard were killed. Charles Gray Little was among the dead. The immense personal sacrifice Joy Bright had made was compounded by professional exclusion. Despite the proven capability of the Yeoman F, the prevailing sentiment in Washington was to return the military to a purely male domain. The Naval Reserve Act of 1925 explicitly limited the reserve to male citizens. Senator Wadsworth defended this restrictive measure by citing far-reaching, even unknown, implications. The door that wartime necessity had briefly opened was now slammed shut by legislation. The critical service provided by women was discarded. Joy Bright, a grieving widow and proven asset, was forced to return to the Navy as a civilian employee. She carried the weight of her personal loss and the institutional betrayal of her service. The legislative door slammed shut on uniformed female service in 1925. Yet, the Navy's reliance on skilled women did not cease. The institutional rejection of the Yeoman, following World War I created a profound paradox. Women were deemed ineligible to wear the uniform, yet they were absolutely indispensable to the technical core of the service. Joy Bright Hancock, now a civilian employee, embodied this contradiction. Stripped of her rank but not her expertise, she continued her career in the Bureau of Aeronautics, the Navy's most forward-thinking division. She served as the first editor of the Bureau's newsletter. By 1942, she was in charge of the Bureau's General Information section. She and hundreds of other women were the unacknowledged backbone of the Navy's shore establishment. They were critical assets who could manage complex contracts and process intelligence, but they could not be deployed or promoted in the military structure because of a single restrictive legal phrase, male citizens. The consequences of the 1925 Act became alarmingly clear by 1941. As the fleet expanded at an impossible rate and men were shipped to forward bases, the Navy realized it had reached the bottom of the manpower barrel. The Bureau of Aeronautics estimated they required over 20,000 women immediately. This included nearly 7,000 for demanding roles, like aviation machinist mates, but institutional inertia was a powerful force. When asked to consider integrating women, most naval bureaus responded with general indifference and built-in conservatism. One observer noted the prevailing sentiment among many admirals was that they would have preferred non-human recruits to women. They were facing a modern war requiring industrial and technical competence, yet their thinking remained trapped by outdated societal norms. The legislative battle to overcome this resistance was protracted and bitter. The Navy's official bill was rejected by the Bureau of the Budget for being not in accord with the program of the President. This created long, frustrating delays. The impasse was broken not by official channels, but by an under-the-table effort. Dr. Margaret Chung, a San Francisco socialite with deep connections to naval aviators, grew impatient with the Navy Department's weak efforts. She approached Representative Melvin Mass of Minnesota and asked him to introduce independent legislation. Mass immediately did so in March 1942. An identical Senate bill quickly followed. The legislative battle was officially on, and the opposition was formidable. Senator David I. Walsh of Massachusetts, chairman of the Senate Naval Affairs Committee, became the most vocal opponent. He argued fiercely against the feminine invasion of an area sacred to manhood. For Walsh, the question was not about logistics or skill. It was about preserving an area he deemed sacred to manhood, insisting a woman's place was in the home. The advocates, realizing they needed political, heavy artillery, turned to the White House. Dean Harriet Elliott wrote directly to First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, championing the cause. Mrs. Roosevelt recognized the necessity and the precedent set by the Army's successful Women's Auxiliary Army Corps. She secured the crucial presidential support. In June 1942, the Secretary of the Navy was informed that President Roosevelt had given him carte blanche to go ahead and organize the Women's Reserve. With the political wind finally behind them, the Navy moved to create a distinct identity for its new contingent. Professor Elizabeth Reynard coined the name WAVES. WAVES stood for Women Appointed for Volunteer Emergency Service. Reynard strategically noted that the inclusion of the word emergency was meant to comfort the older admirals. It implied that their service was only a temporary crisis. The temporary crisis became permanent history on July 30, 1942. President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Public Law 689, formally establishing the Women's Reserve of the Naval Reserve. The stroke of the presidential pen was the turning point. Despite agonizing delays and bureaucratic friction, the Navy was now forced to adapt at breakneck speed. The initial conservative estimate of 10,000 total women was immediately discarded. It was replaced by a staggering requirement for 75,000 enlisted women and 12,000 officers. The door that had been slammed shut in 1925 was now thrown wide open by the overwhelming necessity of global war. The women who would soon step through were no longer temporary wartime clerical aides. They were the essential, technical, and operational personnel the modern Navy could not survive without. The legislative victory that birthed the waves was only the first step. The challenge now was to turn thousands of civilian women into disciplined naval personnel at breakneck speed. The sheer scale of the required mobilization forced the Navy to convert vast civilian infrastructure into military training grounds. While officer trainees were sequestered at Smith College, the enlisted women needed a centralized boot camp. The Navy selected Hunter College in the Bronx, a massive civilian day school, for the mammoth assignment. Captain William F. Amsden assumed command in January 1943. He faced the immediate chaotic task of militarizing the campus. To house the incoming recruits, the Navy had to condemn 13 nearby apartment buildings. They tore down walls and installed 1,500 double-decker bunks in former living rooms. The U.S. Naval Training Center, Double Jar, was commissioned on February 8, 1943. It quickly became known as the USS Hunter. It was a factory of discipline, grinding thousands of women through a rigorous schedule that began at dawn. The recruits endured tests, inoculations, marching drills, and endless lessons in naval protocol. This intensive, structured environment successfully converted over 80,000 women into disciplined service members. The quality of this rapid training was underscored by surreal moments. The world-renowned conductor Leopold Stokowski directed the Waves Choir in a concert. Their clear, young voices echoed the newfound resolve of the Navy's newest recruits. Yet, even as the women proved their mettle, institutional resistance continued to impose artificial limits on their utility. The initial Waves law contained serious flaws. Women doctors were restricted from being enrolled in the Navy Medical Corps on the same terms as men. This short-sightedness was quickly exposed by the escalating demands of the war. By spring 1943, necessity forced Congress's hand. The passage of Public Law 38 authorized the enrollment of women doctors. This signaled a significant, if reluctant, step toward full legislative acceptance. By the following winter, over 140 women officers were working in medical activities. Their acceptance was now being driven by essential competence, not just emergency replacement. Nowhere was this competence more critical than in naval aviation. The Bureau of Aeronautics had championed the inclusion of women from the start. BUAR recognized that the Navy had reached the bottom of the manpower barrel. They needed technical specialists, not just typists. Captain Arthur W. Radford successfully advocated for a coeducational method of technical training. This integrated Waves directly into schools previously dominated by men. This model proved both economical and highly effective. It fostered a healthy competition that ensured identical standards and eased the eventual transition to integrated work teams. The Waves quickly excelled, shattering the myth that women lacked the aptitude for complex technical roles. In the intense, high-pressure world of the Naval Air Transport Service, Waves officers trained as aviation transport officers, or ATOs. These women were not flying the planes. They were the operational nerve center on the ground. They supervised cargo loading and used a slipstick, or slide rule, to calculate weight and balance. They ensured that critical flights departed on time, demonstrating thoroughness and unfailing attention to detail in their day and night duties. The technical expansion continued into highly specialized fields. When a critical shortage arose for air navigation instructors, the Navy turned to Waves. The role required a keen mind for visualization and the mathematics of trigonometry. The first women navigation instructors reported to Hollywood, Florida, where they mastered the Link Celestial Navigation Trainer. Simultaneously, Waves officers reported to institutions like MIT and UCLA for rigorous meteorology courses. They learned to decode weather reports and take soundings essential for flight safety. Waves were also integrated into the nascent field of photo interpretation. Former architect lieutenant, junior grade, Natalie Hoyt became an instructor in this field. She proved that specific civilian experience translated directly into crucial military expertise. The ultimate test of their capability came in physically demanding, hands-on, mechanical ratings. These included aviation machinist mates and metalsmiths. These were not desk jobs. Waves worked 12-hour days, sometimes 7 days a week, in noisy hangars. They were the essential ground crew, climbing in and out of planes used for pilot training. Their hair was bound tightly in turbans, their coveralls smeared with grease, and their hands often raw and red from the work. Their meticulousness earned them grudging respect. One grizzled chief on the flight line admitted he had never had cleaner planes on the line. They took no shortcuts, adhering strictly to the maintenance manuals. In one notable instance, a wave metalsmith ranked at the top of her graduation class. She earned the traditional signet ring, a symbol of supreme technical achievement. The ring was, ironically, several sizes too large for her hand. The moment underscored the profound shift underway. The size of a woman's hand, once cited as a limitation, was now irrelevant. Their dedication and competence were now the measures of service, solidifying their place in the heart of naval aviation. By the summer of 1944, the Waves had proven their indispensability on the home front, but the war's expansion demanded their presence in forward areas. The initial legislation, designed to comfort the older admirals, had explicitly forbidden foreign service. This restriction had become a critical operational hindrance. The legislative correction came on September 27, 1944. Public Law 441 finally granted Waves permission for overseas assignment in the American theater and Hawaii. It also clarified dependent allowances. This formally recognized them not as a temporary domestic auxiliary force, but as global personnel essential to the war effort. The psychological shift was profound. Women who had once been categorized as replacements for men now officially joined the ranks of those supporting the fleet in the Pacific. This rising status was reflected in the increasing use of waves in formal naval ceremonies. Captain Joy Bright Hancock, herself a Waves officer, was an increasingly visible presence. She served as a powerful symbol connecting the Navy's past sacrifices to its future competence. Her role in sponsoring naval vessels, such as the USS Lewis Hancock, named for her lated this growing integration. It proved that women were now interwoven into the very fabric of naval tradition and honor. The first tangible result of Public Law 441 was the deployment to the Pacific. The Navy was cautious, selecting only the highest-rated personnel. The arrival of Waves in Hawaii on January 6, 1945, cemented their role as operational assets in the critical theater. They arrived to a new reality. The paradise of the Pacific was a high-pressure military hub. Their technical skills immediately took the place of men bound for combat. Then, the war ended with a suddenness that shocked the military establishment. The rapid collapse of Japan in August 1945 brought VJ Day, which one officer lamented was a sneak surrender. The Navy, bound by public and congressional demand to return servicemen home, implemented poorly communicated demobilization policies. The directive, ALNAV 196-45, set separation point scores. It was immediately interpreted by reserve personnel as an unceremonious invitation to be gone at once. The resulting rapid exodus of experienced Waves personnel created gaping holes in the shore establishment. The crisis was immediate and severe. Operations like Magic Carpet, the massive undertaking to return 3 million reservists by sea, were crippled. Admiral Ezra Kendall warned that the program could not continue without replacement personnel. In the midst of this chaos, the necessity of the remaining Waves became starkly apparent. At naval air stations like Banana River, Florida, personnel shortages forced commanding officers to rely entirely on women for the highly technical ground-controlled approach program. The author personally witnessed these young women in the darkened room of the mobile trailer. They sat before radar screens, their voices calm and accurate, coaching pilots through emergency landings in zero-visibility conditions. Their efficiency in radar and communication was irreplaceable. It demonstrated that the Navy's operational capacity was now reliant on the very women it was trying to discharge. The legislative fight for permanent status began almost immediately. It was driven by the irrefutable evidence that women were essential for future national security. Captain Hancock, appointed director of the Waves in July 1946, based her planning on the premise of full integration. Yet, she faced immense bureaucratic inertia and institutional apathy. To overcome resistance in policy conferences, Hancock resorted to an unconventional, determined tactic. She announced she would append any negative or dismissive recommendations to her final, official report to the Chief of Naval Personnel. This move usually inspired immediate cooperation. The legislative process was a long, frustrating struggle. The Navy Bill S-1527 had to be reconciled with the Army and Air Force proposals. During the rigorous Senate hearings in 1947, advocates had to combat deeply ingrained societal prejudices. A major hurdle involved the popular fallacy that physiological changes, specifically menopause, would render women unfit for career military service. This objection was successfully countered by the Navy's Surgeon General, Admiral Swanson. He delivered powerful medical evidence, affirming that menopause was a normal change. He also noted that a similar involutional period occurred in men. The medical testimony effectively eliminated a key, sexist objection to permanency. Despite this success, the fight was not over. In March 1948, the House Committee on Naval Affairs reported the bill with a catastrophic amendment. Permanency was approved only for the reserve components, leaving the regular Navy open only to men. The advocates were left in absolute astonishment. This set off a period of mad and determined activity involving intense lobbying and political maneuvering. After years of setbacks, legislative skirmishes, and administrative chaos, the tenacity of the Waves leadership paid off. The differences were finally reconciled in a joint conference. On June 12, 1948, the Women's Armed Services Integration Act, Public Law 625, was approved. It was signed into law on July 30, 1948. This established a permanent place for women in the regular Navy and Naval Reserve. The door, which had been slammed shut in 1925 and only opened for emergency service in 1942, was now permanently secured for American women. The signing of Public Law 625 on July 30, 1948, was the institutional realization of a long-fought goal. It guaranteed that women, having proved their indispensable worth in a world war, would never again be relegated to temporary emergency status. The shift was immediate and profoundly symbolic. Just 1 week after the bill became law, the first group of enlisted Waves stood before Secretary of the Navy John L. Sullivan. They were sworn into the regular Navy. Sullivan welcomed them by noting that they had developed talents and techniques superior to those of the men whom they released. 3 months later, the first women officers followed. This completed the transition from a wartime reserve experiment to a permanent, integrated component of the nation's defense structure. The timing of this integration proved critical. The ink was barely dry on the new law before the Navy was forced to test its permanent commitment. The outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 necessitated the immediate recall of reservists. It accelerated the Navy's demand for personnel. The Waves component, now formally established, validated its permanent status by providing the necessary manpower expansion. This avoided the panicked, chaotic legislative battles of 1942. As the program expanded rapidly, the Waves were increasingly integrated into formerly all-male environments. The success of this integration was not measured in efficiency reports alone. It was measured in the subtle, yet profound shifts in naval culture. One of the greatest fears voiced by the older guard was that the mixing of genders would lead to disruption and a collapse of discipline. This fear was immediately disproved in facilities across the country. At the Anacostia Mess Hall, the Chief Master at Arms anxiously braced for the worst when Waves were integrated into the chow line. He later recounted his surprise. The women's presence brought such orderliness and courtesy that there wasn't a loud word of any kind by the men. He concluded that the mere presence of Waves achieved more discipline than the stoutest chief boatswain could enforce. Disciplinary cases decreased across mixed-gender commands. This demonstrated that women were not only effective service members, but also a positive influence on the entire force. Yet, rapid growth brought new administrative challenges. By the early 1950s, the program had expanded so quickly that a significant supervision deficit emerged. Only 17.5% of enlisted women held petty officer rank. This lack of close supervision created an undesirable situation. It was exacerbated by the necessity of assigning the few available trained petty officers to critical operational roles. To address this crisis, The Navy established petty officers' leadership schools in February 1953. These were located at San Diego and Bainbridge, Maryland. This ensured that the new permanent female force would have the command structure necessary for sustained effectiveness. The legacy of the waves was not confined to morale or manpower. It permanently altered the physical standards of the U.S. Navy. During the war, the need to house thousands of women in open dormitories required creative solutions for privacy. Waves engineers and administrators developed the cubicle system. This divided large barracks rooms into semi-private areas. This standard, born of necessity for the women's program, was soon recognized as superior for all personnel. The cubicle system became the norm for all new naval barracks construction. It indirectly benefited male personnel and cemented the Waves' influence on the quality of life throughout the service. Throughout this period of transition, the role of advocacy was crucial. In July 1951, the Defense Advisory Committee on Women in the Services, or DACOWITS, was created. Composed of civilian women, this committee served as a powerful external check. It fought institutional apathy and ensured that women received equitable assignments, better training, and improved public perception. Their work ensured that the promise of the 1948 Act was continually fulfilled. Captain Joy Bright Hancock retired in June 1953. She had spent her life transitioning women's service from a controversial World War I experiment to a fundamental permanent component of the modern Navy. She had championed the cause from the front lines of bureaucracy, but the final restrictive barriers of the 1948 Act, which limited the ranks women could achieve, remained. The ultimate fulfillment of the permanent integration came 14 years later. By the mid-1960s, the value of female personnel was no longer debatable. On November 8, 1967, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed a bill that removed all remaining rank restrictions for women in the armed services. For the first time in American history, women could pursue full, unrestricted careers. They could advance to the highest ranks of the Navy. The word emergency had been dropped from their title decades earlier. With the removal of rank limitations, the final vestiges of their temporary status were annihilated. The door that had been slammed shut in 1925, begrudgingly opened in 1942, and formally secured in 1948, was now entirely unobstructed. Women were cemented as indispensable members of the U.S. Navy, their permanent foundations secured for the conflicts and challenges of the future.